So you've probably seen a lot of commentators, especially when it comes to the area of looking at what's going on in Ukraine, really, really worried about the massive holdup that is being caused by Republicans over funding Ukraine and essentially helping them able to fend off this Russian invasion. Without those funds, this starts to cause a lot of problems for Ukraine. It stops them being able to hold territory, like in Ardivka, where we are seeing the Russians launch an attack because now they haven't got enough money for artillery shells, equipment coming from those that money as well. This caused problems for them, and one of the reasons why we should support Ukraine is because eventually even Russia is not going to be able to continue this war, even economically, where it is legitimately having problems with its economy to be able to fight this war. And it is hoping to be able to at least get past the next presidential election, which it hopes will be a Trump victory, to where Trump will come in and do whatever. Who knows what kind of crazy deal he will suggest that gets put on the floor. And then at that point, Trump might go, well, look, hey, Russia wants to do this deal, but Ukraine doesn't. So I'm not going to support Ukraine anymore. And we've actually seen in Russian media them celebrating the fact that this holdup in this, in the House is being celebrated because they're seeing it as a way to now achieve victory without fighting on the field of battle. And that if now Ukraine gets deprived of these supplies, well, then slowly they can push the Ukrainians back. And then, of course, what happens? The Ukrainians have an even weaker position when it comes to a negotiating table. Because remember, they are claiming 4 territories. And you've even had more recently the guy from Chechnya go and say, oh, they should push all the way on to Odessa. And remember, in the initial plans that Russia has proposed for peace, it wants to take all the Ukrainian coastline, not just up to the point of Zaporozhye. It wants to go all the way around, right round to Odessa, right up to Moldova as well. That is the stated goal. And if they can do that, if they can push for that in negotiations, well, Ukraine might not have too many options to be able to push back against that. And unfortunately now, where we are seeing that chaos go in America, we are now seeing this happen in Europe. And as I keep on saying, David Lammy needs to really be, and I do hope he is generally thinking about this, but he needs to have a serious plan and what should happen if there is a Trump win. And he needs to really rally Europe to Ukraine. Because we've said this before, that if Russia claims this as a victory, and this is seen as a victory for these authoritarian regimes, you've got a lot of places around the world where these authoritarian regimes might decide to start taking action. You've got, obviously, China against Taiwan. You've got Venezuela going into Guyana. You've got Ethiopia possibly going into Eritrea again. You've even got potentially a war between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo brewing as well. There's a lot of flashpoints, and a lot of people are seeing this, or at least how the Ukrainian conflict turns out will be a signal whether or not they can deploy their own green light for their own invasions and taking of territory. And in Europe, at the moment, we are having an even bigger problem because guess what? We've got Viktor Orbán to worry about because Viktor Orbán has sent a letter to the EU threatening to blow up its entire Ukrainian policy and holding millions worth of euros in aid that could be going to Ukraine hostage. And Viktor Orbán is threatening that. So in his recent letter, he said this, that the European Council should take stock of the implementation of the effectiveness of our current policies towards Ukraine, including various assistance programs. Why is Viktor Orbán questioning the assistance programs? Why would he be doing that? I have to question. Oh, that because, prior to this, he was actually quite friendly with Putin, and then when the invasion happened, sort of distanced himself, but not fully. And Hungary has been one of the Europe. Well, was probably been Hungary and of course Serbia, who have been sort of very, very openly pro-Russia prior to this, sort of distanced themselves, but not too much, shall we say. But it continues. The European Council must have a frank and open discussion on the feasibility of the EU strategic objectives in Ukraine. Do we still regard these objectives as realistically attainable? Is the strategy sustainable without robust support from the United States? Can we continue support? Can we take the continuing support of the United States for granted? How do we conceive a security architecture for Europe after the war? The European Council is not in any position to make key decisions on the proposed security guarantees or even additional financial support for Ukraine and endorse further strengthening of the EU sanction regime or even agree on the future enlargement process unless a consensus of the future strategy towards Ukraine is found. And this is what he is doing. He is trying at this moment, I believe, to be a Trojan horse for Putin. Everything that he is saying is, well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't support Ukraine. I'm just asking questions. I'm just asking questions about how we do this. I mean, let's go through some of those questions. So first of all, do we still regard these objectives as realistically attainable? Absolutely. So far in this war, Ukraine has liberated over 50% of the land occupied by Russia. This idea that Ukraine cannot retake land is absolutely ridiculous. When they have the equipment, when they have the funding, when they have the logistical supplies given to them, they have shown time and time again, yes, they can do that and they can achieve. They can do it. And then, of course, the United States question. Is this strategy still sustainable without robust support from the United States? Absolutely. It's all European countries have to commit. And we have to commit and realize that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, what might stop him from maybe going into another European country? What, for example, happens if Lukashenko dies in Belarus? He's not, shall we say, the biggest spring chicken. And if he dies, does Putin just then roll the troops in and just take Belarus? And at that point, Russia is then on the doorstep of Poland. The Suwalki Gap is then potentially one of the biggest cornerstones that gets talked about a lot when people talk about a potential Russia-European war, locking off the Baltic states or even the Baltic states themselves, because a lot of the arguments that Putin deployed to invade Ukraine also apply to those countries as well. And he goes on to talk about what about, more security architecture for Europe? Well, that's NATO. That should be a NATO question, not really asked at the EU. The EU has never really been a defensive or military pact. It is very much sort of an economic one. But that is more of a question for NATO. And getting Ukraine into NATO after this war should be seen as a big number one priority. Because as a lot of people have said, in the future, if there is some sort of deal or something done that freezes the conflict for whatever, how can you guarantee that Russia is not going to do another invasion in Ukraine in 5, 6, 7 years? It's not beyond the realms of possibility. Or if that doesn't happen, what's maybe Putin to try and maybe seriously poke the bear and go into one of like the Baltic countries to see what happens there and maybe take some land from them, you know, and really sort of trigger and put Article 5 to the test, especially if you've got Trump in the White House. I keep on talking about it, but it is a serious, serious problem. A serious problem. And we have to take this threat seriously, because if we do not, then we will end up in a far more serious conflict. And we've got to take it seriously. And unfortunately, you've got people like Viktor Orbán who will gladly say, yes, Putin was, my friend and a close ally. Oh, no, I don't now like what he's done, but I'm not going to distance myself too clearly. But in quote, asking these questions, he is clearly trying to signal, hey, I was just asking questions, Putin. So, eventually when all these quote, sanctions come to an end, or at least, should we say, be more willing to end these sanctions. Because this is the other thing that the EU wants to do to impose sort of more sanctions. I think what is going to happen is Lamy will have to have some sort of summit, invite all these European leaders and even the EU as well, and basically say, look, if Hungary is going to opt out, then we have to make sure that we agree to some sort of treaty that says this is what we're going to do. And even if sort of Hungary doesn't agree, well, all these countries individually are all acting as one to be able to sort of tighten more sanctions, to supply more aid to Ukraine, both militarily and economically as well. We have to really start seriously taking this as a threat. And that's where we have to go on this. Because if we don't, Putin will try this again. If he sees this as a success and goes, well, we'll have this quote frozen conflict for a couple of years. We've prepared our economy to sort of take the hit more this time. We're more prepared militarily to sort of go in and take this territory and sort of get what we want. You can see why in the future this becomes a problem, and the outcome of Ukraine could be a not an end point, but the starting point for many future conflicts. And I say this to anyone who says, "Oh, we just want peace in Ukraine." Would your peace? Could you seriously say for a second that your peace would not trigger further conflicts in the future? Because everyone at one point in the peace movement thought that Versailles was the perfect peace plan that would solve any future conflicts. And yet Versailles is the epitome of a bad peace, or become to known as the epitome of a bad peace. Just because you get peace tomorrow does not mean you will guarantee peace in a year's time. That's something you should all think about. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, as always, there are links down below to also help the channel, the Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the Pony Club. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.